The Avro Lancaster was Britain's most iconic and feared heavy bomber of World War II, a four-engine giant that carried the weight of the Allied bombing campaign deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. Designed to deliver devastating payloads to targets hundreds of miles behind enemy lines under the cover of darkness, the Lancaster became the workhorse of RAF Bomber Command's strategic offensive against the Third Reich. With its distinctive silhouette and thunderous Merlin engines, it represented British determination to bring the war to Germany's industrial heartland. But behind the aircraft's legendary reputation and its role in famous operations like the Dam Busters raid lies a horrifying and often overlooked truth. Flying combat missions in a Lancaster was statistically one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire Second World War, with crew mortality rates that exceeded even frontline infantry soldiers charging into machine gun fire. Today we'll explore in detail the terrifying reality faced by these seven-man crews who climbed into their aircraft night after night, the unimaginable dangers they confronted on every sortie over enemy territory, the psychological toll of sustained operations, and why many veterans considered each mission essentially a death sentence that only the bravest young men volunteered to face repeatedly. We'll examine the aircraft itself, the men who flew it, the nightmarish conditions they endured, and the enemies that hunted them through the darkness. When the Lancaster entered operational service with RAF Bomber Command in early 1942, it represented a massive leap forward in British strategic bombing capability. Developed from the troubled Manchester bomber, the Lancaster was powered by four reliable Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same power plants that drove the legendary Spitfire fighter. With a wingspan of over 102 feet and weighing up to 72,000 pounds when fully loaded, it was an imposing machine. Its cavernous bomb bay, stretching 33 feet in length, could accommodate an extraordinary variety of ordnance, from thousands of small incendiary bombs designed to create firestorms in German cities, to massive blockbuster bombs, and ultimately the colossal 22,000-pound Grand Slam, the largest conventional bomb used in the war. No other Allied bomber could match this payload capacity combined with reasonable range and reliability. But this impressive capability came at an extraordinary cost to the men who flew them. The Lancaster's operational ceiling was around 24,000 feet, and like most bombers of its era, it was completely unpressurized. At these altitudes, crews endured bone-chilling cold that words can barely describe, with temperatures routinely plummeting to minus 40 degrees Celsius or even lower. The men wore multiple layers, including heated, electrically wired suits, thick wool undergarments, leather jackets, and insulated boots, but these heating systems frequently malfunctioned or were damaged by flak and gunfire. The result was severe frostbite that cost many airmen their fingers, toes, noses, or ears. Some crew members would return from missions to discover they couldn't feel their feet, only to watch in horror as their blackened toes fell off days later. The oxygen system was equally problematic. Each crew member breathed through a rubber mask connected to the aircraft's oxygen supply, but these masks would freeze with condensation from their breath, ice would block the valves, and men would suffocate if they didn't quickly clear them. Stories abound of crew members simply falling unconscious from oxygen deprivation, and if their situation wasn't noticed immediately by another crew member, they would die within minutes. The combination of extreme cold, oxygen deprivation, and the constant threat of violent death created an environment of sustained physiological and psychological stress that few modern people can truly comprehend. Unlike the American 8th Air Force, which conducted daylight precision bombing raids in their B-17s and B-24s, RAF Bomber Command made the strategic decision to operate primarily at night. This decision came after devastating losses during early daylight raids proved that unescorted bombers, even heavily armed ones, couldn't survive against determined fighter opposition in broad daylight. While night operations provided some cover from the masses of German day fighters, it introduced its own unique and terrifying challenges that would haunt crews for the rest of their lives, however long that might be. Night missions meant crews flew for hours through pitch darkness, navigating by instruments, map reading, and celestial observations when clouds permitted. They never knew what waited in the blackness around them. German night fighters could be stalking them from any direction, invisible until the moment they opened fire. The psychological impact of flying blind through hostile airspace, knowing that death could come from any angle without warning, created a constant state of nervous tension that was utterly exhausting. Some men described it as being hunted by wolves in a dark forest, except the forest was 5 miles above the earth, and the wolves had cannons. The night raids also meant significantly longer missions compared to daytime operations. A typical deep penetration raid into Germany would last 8 to 10 hours, sometimes more. Crews would take off in the evening, fly through the night, hit their target in the early morning hours, and return to base as dawn was breaking, if they returned at all. During these marathon flights, men had to remain alert and ready to react instantly to threats, while simultaneously dealing with cold, oxygen masks, equipment malfunctions, and the primitive toilet facilities, essentially a chemical bucket in the fuselage that was nearly impossible to use while wearing bulky flight gear and oxygen equipment. Sleep deprivation between missions became chronic for operational crews. During intensive bombing campaigns, squadrons would fly multiple operations per week, sometimes several nights in a row. Crews would land at dawn after a harrowing 10-hour mission, attend debriefing, try to eat something despite adrenaline-shattered appetites, sleep fitfully for a few hours while reliving the night's terrors, and then discover they were on the battle order again for that same evening. This brutal operational tempo broke men psychologically and physically, and Bomber Command had limited sympathy for those who couldn't continue.
The Lancaster crew consisted of 7 men, each with specialized roles that were essential to the aircraft's operation and survival. The pilot, who commanded the aircraft, the flight engineer, who monitored engines and fuel, the navigator, who plotted their course through the darkness, the bomb aimer, who guided them to the target, the wireless operator, who maintained communication with base, the mid-upper gunner, who defended from above, and the rear gunner, who protected their tail. These weren't grizzled veterans. The average age was just 22 years old. They were barely more than boys, fresh from civilian life, thrust into one of the most dangerous roles in military history after just months of training. These young men faced a brutal statistical reality that was kept quiet, but that everyone in Bomber Command knew. During the height of the strategic bombing campaign from 1943 to 1945, the chances of surviving a complete tour of 30 operations were less than 25%. Let that sink in. If you joined a bomber crew, you had less than 1 chance in 4 of living through your required missions. The mathematics were even more grim when broken down further. Out of every 100 airmen who joined Bomber Command, approximately 55 would be killed in action, 12 would become prisoners of war, often after being badly wounded, 3 would be seriously injured in crashes, and only around 30 would survive their tour of operations physically unscathed, though none escaped psychologically unchanged. This was the highest casualty rate of any Allied service branch in the entire war, higher than infantry soldiers storming beaches, higher than submariners, higher than anyone, and yet they continued to volunteer. If every position on a Lancaster was dangerous, the rear gunner's position was arguably the worst. Positioned in the tail turret at the very back of the aircraft, he was separated from the rest of the crew by the entire length of the fuselage, over 50 feet of cold aluminum between him and the nearest human being. He sat cramped in a perspex bubble barely big enough for his body, with his back to the aircraft, staring into the infinite black void behind them for hours on end, searching for the shadow that would mean death was approaching. The turret was so cramped that rear gunners often flew without their parachute because there simply wasn't room for both the gunner and the parachute pack. Instead, they hung their parachute inside the fuselage and would have to rotate the turret to a specific position, open the doors, crawl backward out of the turret, grab their parachute, clip it on, and then make their way to an exit. A process that might take 30 seconds under ideal conditions, but that was nearly impossible in a plunging, burning aircraft. Many rear gunners facing certain death simply stayed in their turrets and rode the aircraft down, either because they couldn't escape or because they chose to go down with their crewmates. The turret doors were often removed entirely to prevent them from jamming in combat or freezing shut, which meant rear gunners sat in the open air at minus 40 degrees Celsius, fully exposed to the elements for the entire mission. The cold was so intense that some rear gunners would lose consciousness from hypothermia, especially on longer missions. They were the most likely crew member to be killed because German night fighters, as we'll discuss, typically attacked from behind and below. The rear gunner was specifically trained to spot them and call evasive maneuvers, but often the first indication of an attack was tracer fire coming directly at them. Many rear gunners never saw what killed them, just a sudden burst of 20mm cannon fire tearing through their perspex bubble, and then nothing. Veterans who survived as rear gunners spoke of the profound isolation and terror of the position. One rear gunner described it as sitting in a glass coffin, waiting to be shattered. Another said that every mission he would say goodbye to his turret before climbing out after landing, never certain he would see it again, or more precisely, never certain he would leave it alive next time. The mid-upper gunner occupied a powered turret positioned behind the wings, armed with two .303 Browning machine guns. Unlike the rear gunner, he could stand within his turret and had a 360-degree field of vision, able to scan the darkness above and to the sides of the aircraft. However, this also made him highly visible, and his prominent position drew fire from attacking fighters. He stood for the entire mission, 8 to 10 hours, with no ability to sit down, constantly scanning for threats, operating in the same freezing conditions as his comrade in the rear. Neither gunner could wear their parachute while in their turrets. They had to grab their parachute pack and clip it onto their harness if the order to bail out was given, precious seconds that could mean the difference between escape and death. In rapidly descending aircraft, the centrifugal forces could make it impossible to move, trapping gunners in their turrets as the aircraft spiraled into the ground. The bomb aimer lay prone in the nose of the aircraft during the bombing run, operating the bomb sight and guiding the pilot over the target. This position gave him an excellent view through the clear nose cone, but it also made him highly vulnerable to flak coming up from below. During the bomb run, which could last several minutes, the pilot had to fly straight and level, making no evasive maneuvers, turning the Lancaster into an easy target for German gunners. The bomb aimer would watch flak bursts exploding all around them, shrapnel tearing through the fuselage, sometimes seeing aircraft ahead of them explode or fall away burning, all while calmly directing the pilot, left, left, steady, right slightly, steady, bomb's gone. The pilot and flight engineer sat side by side in the cockpit, working together to keep the heavy aircraft flying. The pilot bore the ultimate responsibility for the aircraft and crew, making life or death decisions constantly throughout the mission. Should they press on despite damage? Should they drop out of the bomber stream and risk being picked off alone? When should they give the order to bail out? The flight engineer monitored the four engines constantly, managed fuel distribution, and helped the pilot with controls in emergencies. Both of them had to exit through incredibly difficult routes if bailing out became necessary. The navigator worked at a small table behind the pilot, plotting their course in darkness by dead reckoning, using whatever navigational aids were available, trying to get them to the target and back home. A mistake in navigation could send them hundreds of miles off course, into unexpected flak concentrations, or worse, leave them lost over the North Sea with insufficient fuel to find land. The wireless operator maintained radio contact with base and other aircraft, monitored communication, and operated various electronic systems. In emergencies, he and the navigator would help wounded crew members and fight fires. The German Luftwaffe developed devastatingly effective night fighter tactics and specialized aircraft to combat RAF Bomber Command's night offensive. The primary night fighter aircraft were twin-engined machines like the Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers UU-88, both equipped with increasingly sophisticated airborne radar systems that allowed them to detect bombers in complete darkness from miles away. These aircraft were flown by highly trained crews, a pilot and a radar operator working in perfect coordination that became some of the most lethal hunters in aviation history. Some German night fighter aces shot down over 100 Allied bombers each, killing or capturing hundreds of Allied airmen. The Germans developed a particularly insidious weapon called Schräge Musik, which translates to slanted music or jazz. These were upward-firing cannons, typically two 20mm or even 30mm cannons, mounted in the fuselage of night fighters at an oblique angle. This allowed the night fighter pilot to position his aircraft beneath and slightly behind a Lancaster, invisible to all the gunners, and fire upward into the bomber's belly, where the fuel tanks and bomb bay were located. The first indication a Lancaster crew had of this type of attack was often their aircraft erupting in flames. There was no warning, no tracer fire to alert them, just sudden catastrophic damage, and then nothing. Schräge Musik was responsible for hundreds of bomber losses, and for a long time, the British didn't even understand what was killing their aircraft. The German integrated air defense system, known as the Kammhuber line, used chains of radar stations across occupied Europe to detect incoming bomber streams and vector night fighters onto them. Ground controllers would guide fighters to the vicinity of the bombers, and then the aircraft's own radar would take over for the final approach and attack. This system became increasingly effective as the war progressed, and German night fighter pilots developed tactics to maximize their kill rates. On the ground, meanwhile, massive searchlight batteries and thousands of anti-aircraft guns created deadly corridors over German cities and industrial targets. The German 88mm flak cannon, effective up to 30,000 feet, was positioned in concentrated batteries around every important target. The flak shells were fitted with time delay fuses, set to explode at the altitude where bombers were expected, scattering red-hot shrapnel in deadly patterns. Flying through a flak barrage at night was a surreal and terrifying experience. Crews would see sudden bright flashes in the darkness all around them, like deadly fireworks, followed by the distinctive sound of shrapnel tearing through aluminum, a metallic ripping sound that veterans never forgot. The unpredictability of both fighters and flak created sustained psychological terror. You could be flying smoothly through the darkness one moment, and the next second your aircraft could be disintegrating around you. There was no front line, no safe area, no trenches to hide in. From the moment you crossed the enemy coast until you returned, you were in constant danger, and there was nothing you could do but continue toward the target and hope that luck was with you tonight. Of all the dangers faced by Lancaster crews, fire was the most feared. The Lancaster carried up to 2,154 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel distributed among tanks in the wings and fuselage, along with tons of high explosives and incendiaries in the bomb bay. A single well-placed tracer round, a fragment of flak, or a burst of cannon fire in the wrong location could turn the entire aircraft into an inferno in seconds. The fuel tanks in the wings were particularly vulnerable. A hit that ruptured a tank would send fuel streaming back over the fuselage, and any spark would ignite it. Crews spoke with dread about seeing aircraft near them suddenly go up, the terrible euphemism for catching fire. One moment the aircraft would be flying in formation, and the next second it would be illuminated from within like a paper lantern, flames shooting from the wings and fuselage before falling away into the darkness. These fires were so bright they could temporarily blind crews in nearby aircraft who were watching. The sight of a bomber burning was traumatic not just because of the horror of watching fellow airmen die, but because every crew member knew that could be them in the next moment. Inside a burning Lancaster, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. Aluminum burns once it gets hot enough, feeding the fire further. Hydraulic lines would rupture, spraying flammable fluid. Ammunition for the guns would begin cooking off, sending bullets ricocheting through the fuselage. Oxygen lines would feed the flames. The interior would fill with toxic smoke, blinding and choking the crew. And through all this, men would be trying to escape, fighting against panic, equipment, and the forces of an aircraft potentially spinning out of control. When a Lancaster was fatally damaged, the pilot would give the order to bail out if he had time and if he was still alive and conscious to give it. The standard procedure was for the pilot to ring the bailout bell and give the order over the intercom. But if the intercom was damaged, or if events were moving too quickly, crew members had to make their own decisions about when to go. The main exit for most of the crew was a hatch in the floor of the fuselage, forward of the wing. In ideal conditions, men would move to the hatch in order, clip on their parachutes, and drop through one by one. But conditions were rarely ideal. In a rapidly descending aircraft, especially one spinning or spiraling, the centrifugal forces could pin men against the walls, making movement impossible. Smoke and fire could block the route to the hatch. Wounded men might be unable to move on their own. The crew would try to help each other, but in the chaos and darkness, with oxygen masks freezing and equipment failing, it was often every man for himself. The pilot and flight engineer had the most difficult escape route. The main exit hatch was behind them, and they had to climb over the main wing spar, a massive structural member running through the fuselage, while wearing bulky flight gear, parachute harness, and possibly injured. Many pilots never even attempted to escape, instead staying with the aircraft and fighting the controls to keep it stable long enough for their crew to get out, sacrificing their own lives for their men. This supreme act of selflessness happened repeatedly throughout the bombing campaign, and many pilots who could have saved themselves chose to die instead. For the gunners trapped in their turrets, escape was even more problematic. They had to rotate the turret to the correct position, open the doors, crawl backward out while the aircraft might be gyrating wildly, find and clip on their parachute in the dark, and make their way to an exit, all while the aircraft was potentially on fire, filling with smoke, and falling. Many gunners, especially rear gunners, simply couldn't get out in time. The thought of being trapped in a turret, watching the ground rush up, unable to escape, haunted every gunner throughout their service. If crew members successfully bailed out over Germany, their ordeal was far from over. Parachuting into enemy territory meant capture was almost certain, if they survived the landing. But unlike the relatively honorable treatment afforded to prisoners of war in some theaters, downed airmen faced significant danger from German civilians. By 1943 and 1944, German cities had been subjected to devastating bombing raids that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroyed vast areas of housing. The German population was increasingly hostile to captured Allied airmen, viewing them as terror bombers and murderers. There are documented cases of downed airmen being lynched by angry mobs, beaten to death, or shot by civilians before military or police authorities could take them into custody. The Nazi regime turned a blind eye to these murders and sometimes actively encouraged them through propaganda. Airmen who landed near recently bombed cities faced the greatest danger. Those who survived to reach prisoner of war camps like Stalag Luft III spent years in captivity, enduring malnutrition, disease, brutal winters, and the constant uncertainty of their fate. Some prisoner of war camps were liberated by Allied forces in 1945, but others were forced on death marches westward as Soviet forces advanced, and many prisoners died during these marches. Ditching in the North Sea presented a different but equally lethal scenario. The water temperature, even in summer, was cold enough to kill within 15 to 30 minutes. In winter, survival time was measured in single-digit minutes. Lancaster crews carried inflatable dinghies that could be deployed if they managed a successful water landing, itself an extremely difficult feat, but rescue in the darkness was problematic at best. Air-sea rescue operations existed and did save some crews, but many men drowned or died of hypothermia in their dinghies, their bodies eventually washing ashore on the coasts of England, Holland, or Germany weeks or months later. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of life in Bomber Command was the sustained psychological pressure. Unlike infantry soldiers who might spend time behind the lines between battles, or fighter pilots who flew shorter missions with immediate results, bomber crews knew that every few days they would climb into their Lancaster for another 8 to 10-hour mission deep into Germany, with roughly 1 in 20 chance of not coming back from that specific mission. The cumulative probability of surviving 30 such missions was horrifically low. This created a unique form of psychological warfare that men waged against themselves. They couldn't show fear or weakness to their crewmates. Morale depended on everyone appearing confident and capable. They couldn't dwell on the statistics or they would be paralyzed with terror. They couldn't talk openly about their fears because that wasn't the culture of the RAF. So they internalized it, developing a dark humor and fatalistic attitude that helped them cope. They would joke about getting the chop, or buying it, or going for a Burton, euphemisms that let them discuss death without confronting it directly. Many crews developed superstitions and rituals, lucky items, particular routines before missions, refusing to fly with certain pilots or on certain days of the month. Some men refused to take photos before a mission or write letters home on operations days, fearing it would jinx them. Crews bonded intensely, knowing they depended on each other absolutely. But this made it even worse when aircraft didn't return. You would eat breakfast with a crew, watch them take off that evening, and their beds would be empty the next morning. Eventually, many men stopped getting close to replacement crews, knowing they probably wouldn't survive long. The psychological breakdown rate in Bomber Command was significant. Men who refused to fly or couldn't continue were branded with LMF, lack of moral fiber, a devastating designation that carried shame and social stigma. They were stripped of rank, dismissed from flying duties, and sent to perform menial tasks. The RAF had little sympathy for psychological casualties, viewing them as cowards rather than recognizing what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder or acute combat stress reaction. Despite these horrific conditions and appalling casualty rates, tens of thousands of young men volunteered for RAF Bomber Command. They weren't conscripted into bomber crews. They volunteered for aircrew duties knowing full well what they were getting into. Stories of losses were impossible to hide, and everyone in Britain knew that bomber crews were being killed in staggering numbers. Yet, they still volunteered. They did it for many reasons. Some believed deeply in the necessity of bringing the war to Germany after years of German bombing of British cities. Some were motivated by patriotism and a desire to serve in what they saw as the most important role. Some were drawn by the prestige and excitement of flying. Many were motivated by their bonds with their crew. They couldn't let their mates down by refusing to fly. And some simply felt it was their duty, regardless of the cost. These young men climbed into their Lancasters night after night, knowing the odds were against them, because they believed it had to be done. They watched friends and crewmates die, attended hasty memorial services for empty coffins, saw their squadron gradually depleted by losses, and still they went back to operations. This kind of sustained courage in the face of almost certain death is difficult for modern people to comprehend. It represents some of the most profound bravery in human history. Of the approximately 125,000 aircrew who served in RAF Bomber Command during World War II, more than 55,000 never came home, a death rate of 44%. Another 8,403 were wounded in action, and 9,838 became prisoners of war. Only about 30 to 35% of Bomber Command aircrew completed their tours of operations without being killed, captured, or seriously wounded. The command suffered more fatalities than the entire Royal Navy during the war, and more than British troops in North Africa and Northwest Europe combined. The Lancaster specifically flew over 156,000 sorties during the war and dropped approximately 608,612 tons of bombs. But behind these statistics were 7,377 Lancasters lost to enemy action and accidents, and the tens of thousands of young men who crewed them and never came home. For the survivors, the trauma never fully left them. Many suffered nightmares, survivor's guilt, and psychological problems for the rest of their lives. Some couldn't bear to discuss their experiences, while others felt compelled to tell the story of their fallen comrades. They came home to a Britain exhausted by war and often indifferent to their sacrifices. The strategic bombing campaign remained controversial, and Bomber Command crews never received a campaign medal, a slight that hurt deeply. But their courage was undeniable. These young men faced death repeatedly with incredible bravery, demonstrating that even in the face of overwhelming terror, human beings can rise to extraordinary heights of valor. The Lancaster bomber may have been a machine, but it was crewed by heroes who deserved to be remembered not just for what they did, but for what they endured while doing it. Every mission was a journey into hell, and far too many never returned.